Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today I have decided that I'm reacting to Carl Benjamin's open letter to Nigel Farage. Now, I've been an open critic of Carl and the other load seaters for quite some time, because I think they're effectively dangerously close to the right-wing version of the quote attributed to George Orwell, even though it's more of a paraphrase, that there are some ideas so stupid only intellectuals could believe them, which may sound a little harsh, but in reality I would attribute it much more to the fact that they seem to thought experiment an awful lot more than the average person. Unfortunately, I think an awful lot of their thoughts do need to stay in the experimental phase. And I'm quite open with my feelings on the Lotus Eaters and their takes. We talk about them a fair bit over on the Worcester Club, I've said it in numerous streams as well, but I very rarely actually do reaction videos to them because at the end of the day, the left are a much bigger issue, frankly. And also, I personally know these people, and I know they're honest actors. And so the approach of this video is going to be much more assuming honesty here, rather than when I react to the left when I assume every other word out of their mouth is a lie. And so, as a reform activist myself, I think that it would be fair for me to go through these and, well, critique it and give advice back. And no, I'm not expecting anything in return for this advice, Mr. Benjamin. So with that, I think we best go ahead.
Dear Mr. Farage, I hope this video letter finds you well. I wanted to summarise the content of many conversations that I've had with very intelligent people who are well-meaning and wish for reform to do well, because it looks like at the moment reform will indeed be the next government of the United Kingdom.
Yes, even on average polling, Reform are ahead by 0.1%, and yes, this is well within the margin of error, but just look at the trends. Labour have burned all their political capital. Reform are getting Conservative voters, Labour voters, there's even some Lib Dems who've moved over. There's a lot of SNP actually who've moved over, because the SNP effectively is the party that people vote for to protest Westminster. Well, guess the party of protest is now? Well, it's Reform. And obviously, I would imagine that Carl and his friends are saying they want Reform to be more than a party of protest. I would argue that they're already there, or if not already there, already well on the way there. And so I'm kind of wondering what this advice is going to be. I'm not saying that Reform don't need advice whatsoever. I make videos including advice for Reform all the time. One major example is I don't think Richard Tye should go on about climate change not being real. Climate change is real, it makes you look a bit like a lunatic, it's potentially going to put people off. The argument you should be making is that yes, climate change is real, but all the problems of climate change are stuff that we'll easily be able to deal with once we grow the economy and have enough resources to actually deal with the problems and make the results of climate change negligible. Get Bjorn Lomborg on board to help you write policy and you'll probably do really well. However, we're here for Carl Benjamin's advice. Take it away.
But the problem is, there's a lot of convergence on the perspective that Reform don't feel like they think they're going to be the next government of the United Kingdom.
I don't agree at all. I don't understand how you could have this perspective. Every time they're on an interview, every time they're at a conference, every time they're giving a speech, they always point at the polls and say Reform are going to win the next election. Hell, this was Nigel Farage's speech at CPAC that he put over on Twitter literally 8 hours from me recording this.
I am now leading, and in historical terms this is incredible, I am now leading Reform UK, and we are now topping every opinion poll in Britain. And we are going to win the next general election and save our country.
Yeah, I don't really know what Carl and his friends mean by it doesn't feel like that they're the party in waiting. I have felt like this probably for about 2 months now. Then again, I'm very optimistic and I do always feel this way earlier than other people. However, there needs to be some examples of this. Why don't people feel like Reform are doing well here? I don't understand.
There's a slight issue in the messaging.
I'm just throwing this out really early. Every time I see someone say something like this, it's just completely wrong. Oh, there's an issue with the immigration. They're falling back on immigration. They're not saying what they said before. Totally untrue. They've been remarkably consistent on the messaging for immigration, especially when they came out with the energy policy the other day that I criticised, remarkably similar to what was already in the contract. The messaging is consistent as far as I can see, and I never understand why people say otherwise. I don't understand why people on the online right thought that Farage was some sort of mega ethnonat, who was some massive anti-Islam figure. He's never been that. He has never called for any sort of, let's call it, remigration of people who came here legally and live by our laws. He simply, frankly, reflects what most people's attitude to immigration is, which is that, yeah, obviously there's been way too much. A lot of it has been with terrible people. Why can't we get rid of criminals from prisons and illegal immigrants? That's largely everyone's deportation position. And then obviously reform are probably going to increase investigation into crimes in areas that probably haven't been investigated for crimes in some time, and you'll find even more foreign criminals that you can deport. So it's not like it's just the prison population that are going to be deported by them. But as I say, I need examples of where this messaging is all over the place.
So for starters, I think you should be dressing for the job that you want, not the job that you have. I can't help but notice that a lot of Reform's media and messaging is coming from the perspective of MPs who are campaigning.
I mean, they are MPs who are campaigning, but okay, you're saying dress for the job that you want. What is the meaningful difference between MPs campaigning and, say, the Tories campaigning last time, or Labour campaigning right now? I mean, from this image you've got on screen, it's not awfully different to Tory campaigning or even Labour campaigning at the moment. Whenever they have a direct message, okay, they don't usually have the Reform Board behind them, but the background isn't usually anything particularly specific. In fact, a lot of the time they're outside with no background whatsoever, so what's your answer here?
Rather than almost existing Prime Minister in waiting, which I think many people view as, I would definitely consider investing in some sort of set or something that always had a set of British flags and possibly some wood panelling in the background, just to make it look prime ministerial.
I personally think that would be a waste of money. This is the office that Nigel Farage typically does his messaging from, if he does it from any particular office. I also think it'd be a massive waste of money because, as you say, they're on the trail all the time. They're either at their constituencies or they're at big reform conferences and events. They're all over the road at farmers' protests and things like that. You can't take a wood panel and these flags. Well, you could probably take the flags with you, but you can't take the wood panelling with you everywhere you go. Hence, you usually see the teal blue Reform logo background all the time because that's just a background they take with them everywhere. It's relatively light. They can just get some guy to do the donkey work to carry it around like a mule. Oh, it's time to make a message, right, get it out, get it sorted, right, film it, right, 2 minutes, right, done. That is how they will be filming these things all the time. Now, you may be able to say, oh, you should improve this office and make the messaging better. Okay, again, you got to look at opportunity cost. I genuinely think that money would be better off used elsewhere, pretty much anywhere, whether it's paying a video editor to make professional political party broadcasts, whether it's to pay for materials to canvas. I think it would even be put to better use just for garden signs, the vote reform signs that go outside people's gardens to encourage people to vote for them. I don't see this as particularly useful. I would also say at this point that if the first thing you bring up for advice here is, oh, your aesthetics aren't quite to my taste, it's arguable that they don't need advice. I think that's the way I'd put it.
And I wouldn't be hesitant to give addresses from this in response to something Keir Starmer has done, or if you just want to announce a reform policy or a statement of fact or something like this.
I mean, don't get me wrong, the background of Nigel Farage's announcement of being on TikTok here, if it had wood panelling and Union Jacks, yes, I indeed think that it would look a lot nicer. However, Reform have always had limited funds and limited resources, and that is still true now, even though they've had a massive increase in donations. But fact of the matter is that they are currently still building the party, as they have a functioning party in Parliament that is the most popular party in Britain at the moment. There's simply just other things that they need to spend the money on. I suppose that this is fine advice, but this is kind of the fifth thing I would say. This is a kind of extra note at the end that I would have. this is the first bit of advice that Carl had. I just want you to bear that in mind, I suppose. You know, is the background here so desperately poor it needs the wood paddling and Union Jacks? I don't think so. It's fine. Yeah, it's not the best it could be, but you're not gonna have the best everything can be as you're building a party, and resources obviously need to go elsewhere.
If people repeatedly perceive you to be in a sort of prime ministerial role, the I will do most of the work for you, and this, I think, will very much help.
Yeah, it might do, but the question is, will it help as much as putting a bunch of money into reform constituency branches? Will it do as much as funding specific campaigns, say, for the farmers, or for net zero, or for immigration? Well, probably not, to be honest with you, so I just find it really weird that this is the first bit of advice he had. I probably would have started with literally any other bit of advice, but to be honest, I don't know what they are yet.
The next thing is, I ask people, who is Nigel Farage going to put in his cabinet when he wins? And people have absolutely no answers for us.
Well, obviously it's going to include Richard Tice, Rupert Lowe and Lee Anderson. And yeah, this is a bit of a problem that Reform absolutely have, but there's not a lot they can do about it because we need answers to all the problems that we have in Britain kind of right now, 5 years ago in fact. And this is why it's actually arguable that probably best case scenario is actually a minority Labour government wins so that they can't actually do much, but then Reform is in opposition to then actually have a cohort of MPs who can get experience, and frankly Farage can find the people who are best suited for each role. He doesn't really have that luxury if he ends up winning the next election. And realistically, I don't really know what the best course of action is, but it'd be interesting to hear what Carl's is.
This is quite strange because I think there are many lessons we can learn from Trump, and I'm going to draw on a bunch of them in this letter.
Well, yeah, but we need to compare it more to Trump's first term, where he ended up having a load of people in who were anything but loyalist and ended up leaking a load of things to the press all the time, and it just caused an awful lot of issues for Trump. This time round, he's got a bunch of loyalists, and, well, this is the problem. It's kind of hard to determine that before you're actually in office and the pressures of office are actually put on people. Hence Trump's second term seems to be so much better, at least domestically.
And I think the first one is make sure you have a very effective team around you, because I'm pretty sure that you must be aware that when you win, you will get non-stop hardcore resistance.
I mean, we're talking about probably the most lied man in politics in the modern era. I think he's aware of that, and he is building a team as we speak. We know this is happening. At least, if Matt Goodwin's to be believed, that is what he is doing. So, okay, decent advice, but this is already happening, so good.
From the civil service and powers that be. They're going to do everything in their power to scupper any plans you have for when you are Prime Minister. So, you need to, I think, prepare now. And what that means is getting a hardcore crack team around you.
Yeah, this is a massive consistent issue I have had with Carl and other low-seaters for quite some time when it comes to reform. It just feels like they don't follow them. Because as I say with the crack team stuff, that is being talked about, it feels like all the time, especially from Matt Goodwin, who was actually on the low-seaters, 2 days ago? Or it was possibly last Friday. It's whenever Conor Tomlinson does his show, he interviewed Matt Goodwin. So it's not like they don't have contact with the very people who are saying these things. But not only that, on screen, I have a literal tweet from Zaya Youssef from, 2-3 weeks ago. Reform is drafting detailed plans to identify, mobilise and remove all elements of the blob hostile to the interests of British people. The plan will be implemented on day one of Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister. I think the other funny thing is that Conor Tomlinson's right underneath saying this is very good to hear. So again, I don't understand, Carl, how you're not aware that this is already happening. It's kind of the annoying thing here. So far the advice has been either not the best advice in the world, or if it's good advice, they're literally already doing it. Which then begs the question, what was the point in the video? And to people who might say, oh, well, he might just not be aware of it, I can't really buy that. It's his job to be aware of these things. And I don't want to say he's bad at his job directly, but again, if this stuff is being announced by the chairman of Reform, and you're giving advice to Reform, I would have, at the very least, looked into whether my advice is being followed already. Because it's not like this Zaya Youssef tweet was said so long ago and your employees weren't aware of it either, that there's really a good excuse to miss this, to be honest with you.
And frankly, that seems to be missing.
Oh, Carl, no. Oh, self-report. Why are you doing this? To be charitable here, Carl does an awful lot of work with the low seaters and does an awful lot of work outside of current event politics. However, it's really bad to announce this doesn't seem to be happening when I have literal evidence that it is happening. From people you've had on your own magazine from the company you run. I don't expect you to watch everything. However, I expect there to be talk in the office. And if what this is giving me the vibes of is that the talk in the office is that this stuff isn't happening. When people in the office have talked to people who have talked regularly about this stuff actually happening. How have you ended up in a position where you miss this?
I don't know who you worked with during Brexit. There are lots of economists, lots of experts in various subject matter fields who would, I think, be very happy to sign on to the Reform agenda and join the Reform Party and be a part of this agenda.
Again, starting off with, I don't know X, Y, or Z, perhaps get these people that I don't know on board. They're already on board. Farage's team is effectively people that he worked on at UKIP with and on Brexit with, and moving them over to the Brexit Party. He's got an awful lot of that team, plus, ex-Tories like Anne Widdecombe and things like that, coming over to Reform as well. You have the odd person who's left over, frankly, personal dislike of Farage, people like Ben Habib and Howard Cox. And they end up leaving and nobody really cares, but they don't seem to be particularly useful people either. But again, this is advice of things that are already happening anyway, so what was the point? It's coming across as very ill-informed as to what is actually going on at the moment. I don't know why you'd have the assumption that Farage, who is frankly one of the best politicians we have in Britain, is just vibing along the way with all his campaigns and everything he says. Of course there's a plan here. I don't know why you'd assume otherwise.
But we don't see them, and we need to see them. They should be with you pretty much at all times, ready to be called upon when something needs to be done.
I've said for some time that GB News is effectively Reform's political party broadcasts, because two of the MPs have shows on it, Nigel Farage and Lee Anderson, and not only that, people, not just the MPs, but people who work for Reform are on the damn channel all the time. And these are the type of people who are advising Farage, they're in the policy works of Farage, with Reform, people like Matt Goodwin, people like Dr. Dan Bull, and these are largely people that Reform can trust and rely on. At the moment, as I say, they are in the process of building the team. You're not going to have the results of a built team while they're building it, are you? So give it time, you'll see it. Again, advice that is just stuff that's already happening.
And the issue is that it seems at the moment you're very isolated and you're carrying the whole thing yourself, which is very commendable and noble, but I don't think it's sufficient.
Very, very big disagree on that. Zaya Youssef, he's on interviews pretty much all the time. Richard Tice, I've heard him on Radio 4 like 3 times whenever I go down to do the horses, since I have it on in the background. Rupert Lowe's doing alternative media tours and is everywhere on Twitter all the time, constantly having arguments with MPs. Nuts to say that this is all Farage's work. Again, especially with Rupert Lowe, how are you missing this? Matt Goodwin, in fact, he even got his own show on GB News. All he does is push Reform UK talking points. My God, I'm kind of flabbergasted. I am flabbergasted you have just said that, actually. There comes a point where you have other things to focus on, just doesn't cut the excuse anymore. I can't believe you've missed all this.
And so I think that if you haven't done this deep preparation now, then you will find yourself with lots and lots of problems later on.
Well, the preparation is happening right now and they have 4 years to prepare, so bear that in mind.
Moving on, I think another thing that you need to think about is the messaging. You, I think, should stop being reactive to the things that they say to you and pretty much stop doing media interviews at this point.
Stop being reactive, maybe. Stop doing media interviews? Are you mad? Are you mad? Legacy media is dying, I appreciate that, but completely avoiding it is absolutely stupendously the wrong move. Whether you like it or not, the people who vote, the biggest cohort of voters in the UK are pensioners and basically people over the age of 40. People who still watch BBC News, people who still listen to Radio 4, people who still trust ITV, Channel 4, Sky. They're legacy media because it's the young people not listening to it, but there are still people listening to it. And even then, when they do an interview on the BBC or something like that, it goes all over Twitter anyway, and people love it. It's like I say, I've heard Richard Tice on Radio 4 a few times. He does well in the interviews. Nigel Farage still goes on to have interviews with the BBC and all that. Why? Because it's obviously good to get their messaging out. They know they're smear merchants, Carl. They can deal with it, and they deal with it quite well. And they're not just exclusively going on to these mainstream media interviews to get their message out there. They have their own Twitter accounts, YouTube channels, TikTok accounts, things like that, where they get the message out too. They're on alternative media all the time. They're on these podcasts with Peter McCormack and Winston Marshall. Andrew Gold gets them on sometimes. You know, we don't have a British version of Joe Rogan, but they're doing their best to get on the podcasts that are getting a decent audience anyway. Trigonometry is another one that they go on. But only relying on alternative media isn't going to work. Even if you bring in Trump into this, which I know you will, he still went on the mainstream. He still talked to the mainstream. It's obviously moronic to not head over to the mainstream. They are dying, but they are not dead. Once they're dead, maybe you have a point, but we're not there yet.
You can become the news cycle in the way that Donald Trump became the news cycle.
Yeah, I'm not being funny, but they kind of are, and they're helped by again, Trump had this advantage with right-wing Twitter anons. They will constantly ride the wave of whatever Max Tempers posts and gains traction. Examples: Labour sending over activists to canvass for Kamala Harris. Number 2, activist judges that are letting in a ridiculous amount of immigrants when they absolutely shouldn't be. There is absolutely a posting to policy pipeline. Reform are a level above what you're advising they actually be. You know, the lowly Twitter anons, Max Tempers and what have you, they can find these news articles, they can find these tidbits of information, send them out there, get them to the mainstream, and Reform pushing it are helpful there. That's their place here, to kind of get the alternative media news stories onto the mainstream. Guess how the best way they do that? Talk to the mainstream as well as the alternative media. Again, this is another example of advice that is already happening.
By simply asserting something that you will do when you are in office and letting everyone else discuss it.
Yeah, and as I just mentioned, they do that by talking to the mainstream media. You know, why say the mainstream media actually taking seriously that maybe the idea of postponing council elections isn't a good idea? Because Reform are constantly talking about it and saying they're doing this so that Reform can't get councils to try and ruin our momentum. They take that seriously and they talk about it. You know, it was talked on Radio 4 last week. I heard it. People are talking about it. Okay, it's not the main story, but that's because other big things are happening. Not everything's got to be top of the agenda. And things that are top of the agenda, you see it in news articles all the time. Reform UK make this statement. Reform UK said this. They're there all the time.
Not only does this increase your power and majesty and make you a more mysterious and interesting figure, not that you're not ready, but you know what I mean.
No, I actually don't know what you mean there.
It allows the commentariat who are sympathetic to you to do something for you. It allows us to speak out in your defence and explain your points of view while you are moving on to the next thing, the next big plan, the next big win that is going to drive them to have to catch up with you.
Hang on, hyper-focusing on this point, who do you mean us? Who do you mean by us, Carl? Do you mean the alternative media such as Lotus Eaters, yourself, other alternative media channels? I suppose you could say I'm in this ecosystem, nowhere near to the extent of other people, of course. But even when it comes to the alternative media in Britain, Lotus Eaters are quite low down and are quite unique in an awful lot of their takes. The main alternative media in the UK, I'd say, are people like Andrew Gold, people are going to hate me for saying this, Trigonometry, Winston Marshall, Peter McCormack, these people who do these long-form interviews, effectively trying to emulate Joe Rogan. Lotus Eaters, of course, are in that ecosystem to some extent. They're good friends with Andrew Gold, for example. But from what I can tell, a lot of these rather larger... I shouldn't say, I don't necessarily mean larger. Larger in terms of with a British audience. Might not be true with Peter McCormack, actually, but it definitely is true with Winston Marshall, Trigonometry, and what have you. They are clearly sympathetic to Reform. So when you say us, you need to be a bit more specific. If you mean the online right in terms of, you know, the Lotus Eaters, AA and all that, as far as I can tell, you're never going to be sympathetic to Reform, because the ideas for what Reform should be are a lot further away from any party that's going to have success. I think your ideas for what reform should be are similar to ideas that ended up killing UKIP. Whereas it kind of needs to be pointed out again, they're way up in the polls. They're doing it by doing what they're doing at the moment, and that momentum's carrying on. I don't really understand how it's going to help them by not going to the mainstream anymore and only focusing on alternative media. And I kind of hate to say it again, but you're incentivized to say that because you're in competition with the mainstream media. But at the end of the day, I do this as a hobby. I don't particularly feel in competition with anyone. And I don't expect anyone in the top brass of reform to interact with me in any way. I just throw this stuff out because it's what's on my mind. So I think I come from a lot more neutral position and understand actually there is still a large media ecosystem in the UK. Like it or not, Politics Joe I always refer to as the new mainstream in waiting. And you've got to bear in mind as well that the mainstream's astroturfed alternative media podcast, The News Agents and Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell's Rest is Politics, they have incredibly large audiences. Massive, in fact. They talk about reform all the time, by the way, as well. But this is the problem. People who watch those two podcasts, they probably watch Newsnights, they probably watch Channel 4, all on demand and all that. So saying just ignore them, you're going to be shooting yourself in the foot. No, you need to get out to as many outlets as possible to get your message out there. Honestly, this is pretty bad advice. Don't follow this advice, reform.
If you're explaining yourself, you're losing. Let us do that for you. You don't need to do it.
Again, who is us? Matt Goodwin is already doing that on GB News. GB News at Large is doing that. Hell, how many Peter McCormack or Winston Marshall interviews have you seen where they will bring up, oh yeah, I heard Nigel Farage talking about that, explain, explain, explain. Oh yeah, Rupert Lowe brought this up, explain, explain, explain. The mainstream media obviously aren't going to do that, but the alternative media, they're already doing it. And from how ill-informed you are, I'm not surprised you don't feel like you can explain for them. You don't seem to know what they're doing.
I would recommend something strong, something simple, and something that is categorically popular.
Britain is broken, Britain needs reform has been their tagline basically since it existed. And keeping consistent with this tagline has ended up, well, with this tweet, I mean, this says it all. They've got the literal tagline, and then they've got, reform being the most popular party in, yet another poll. Again, your advice, Carl, is stuff they are already doing. Which just begs the question, what is your actual problem with what reform are doing at the moment?
For example, I would probably use the catchphrase, we are going to put the Royal Navy in the Channel.
Not to sound like a broken record, but Carl, this has already happened. Rupert Lowe literally asked a parliamentary question about this, and guess what? The media and also the government had to respond to it. On reform's own terms. This is already happening yet again. I'm just going to skip to the next bit of advice. I think I've done this bit to death.
If you start just saying this repeatedly on Twitter or in interviews or wherever, this is what we're going to do, then they will respond to it.
No, this is the problem. Because the issues in Britain are so multifaceted, we have about 20 major crises going on at the same time. If you just focus on one, it's not going to work. Now, you need to focus on a few, and this is why they have Matt Goodwin, because he advises, right, here's what polling say. They're worried about boats this week, talk about that. It's net zero this week, right, announce that policy. They're effectively having to do guerrilla media tactics, more or less. You're not doing that if you just focus on one particular thing and go on about it all the time. Every time the boats come up, the Navy comes up from reform. Again, this is already happening, but if you end up sounding like a broken record, people start to think you're a bit insincere. You kind of have to react to the feeling of the nation all the time. And the nation isn't always going on about the boats, so they're not always going to go on about the boats. It doesn't work like that. You can't just will to power what the media say, because they're going to just start thinking you're crazy if you keep going on about it when it's not particularly relevant that week. Anyway, let's just go to the next bit of advice.
And I think you really need to be worried about Boris.
Let's see what he says, because I'm kind of like yes and no on that. The main reason I say no is because all they have to do is point at the Boris wave and say, you really going to trust this guy? He's the reason we're in this mess. So I don't know about that. I know he's still very popular with people, but you can really change people's opinions on a dime when you say, this man is the reason we're just in a mess at the moment. That's basically why Farage is so hated, actually, because people point at him and say, we got Brexit, this is why we're in a mess, it's Farage's fault. He's a racist, by the way. Reform can obviously do that back to Boris Johnson, just obviously using right-wing talking points. I mean, the man was going to ban petrol cars in 2030. Like, the biggest issues people have with Britain at the moment, Boris Johnson was a big issue with.
Now, it's easy in the intelligentsia or the commentariat for us to have a propositional explanation for why Boris is bad and why we should not back him. But Boris, like the slippery eel that he is, will secrete a thick verbal slime and manage to wriggle out of your rhetorical grip and escape accountability for the betrayal of the British people.
Yeah, it's a rock and a hard place with Boris. Do you either get him on side and hope that he does his wriggly eel thing and help you out, or do you not trust him because, well, you give him any power and he basically just does what his new wife does? It is an odd one because, you know, Carl actually does have this self-awareness. I'm somewhat impressed. But, yeah, the way that the hyper-politically engaged see things is that Boris Johnson is effectively the devil. And that is a fair thing to say because of actual policy that came in under him. However, it's really not that difficult to tell people, oh, you know that open borders thing that, what's it called? Keir Starmer went on about? Yeah, he was talking about Boris Johnson there, by the way. Oh, what do you mean? Oh, here are the statistics. Oh, here's when Boris Johnson was in charge. You see that massive uptick in immigration? Yeah, that was Boris Johnson directly. And if all else fails, just remind them about Partygate. I mean, I think he was done dirty with it, but it's politics, isn't it? Just, you know, agree with the mainstream narrative there. I don't think it'd be that difficult to ruin him.
People forget that 90% of politics is just being likable. Just make sure that people want to be in a room with you, and people are more likely to vote for you.
Yeah, I say this all the time. Politics is like 90% vibes. Like, I had a friend who I saw the other day, and I basically asked him, what do you think, like, decent immigration policy is? And he thinks, oh, I think the centre ground's really with Labour. And I just couldn't be bothered explaining it all to him, because, one, I was drunk, and two, it's kind of hard to know where to start with that. Labour saw the Boris wave and wanted more of it. That is the simplest way I would put it, but he doesn't even know what the Boris wave is. And so this is why you've got to attack him with, well, simple, if unfair, attacks back. Oh, he wrote all these rules on COVID, locked you all down for ages, and then, you know, broke the COVID rules. How can you trust a man like that? It's that simple. Hell, people are starting to distrust Keir Starmer because there's now evidence he broke COVID rules openly. So people still care about that, amazingly. I mean, be wary of him. That's not bad advice. I don't think the trouble's going to be as bad as Carl is saying here, but I still think he could cause trouble, absolutely.
And finally, I would recommend appearing less guarded when you're making public appearances. Now, I appreciate that you have campaigned for 30 years on often unpopular positions to make them popular, and in the course of this, you have personally been assaulted multiple times on the campaign trail. But I think that what you do need to do is look more, I don't know how to frame this properly, but settled?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by this. They're on alternative media all the time. He's got his own show. The only time I really see Nigel Farage guarded, really ironically, is whenever Tommy Robinson comes up. Because he came up again the other day, and honestly, if there's one piece of advice I have for the online right, just stop bringing him up. I don't care about him. People don't care about him. He's really not particularly relevant to modern politics. All you end up doing is putting reform in these awkward positions, and it's just pointless. I mean, as I say, Tommy Robinson came up again yesterday to Nigel Farage, and this is how he acted.
Mr. Farage, I'm from the UK. Hello, I have a question for you. Rupert Lowe says you don't have to hate Tommy Robinson because he's exposing a lot of grooming gangs. So what is your point on that? Because you question sometimes his criminal record on TV.
Well, he's got a very long criminal record. I don't hate him. And by the way, he shouldn't be, whatever I think of him, he shouldn't be in solitary confinement. I hear he's in very bad conditions, and, and that's not right.
I mean, even there he seems fairly settled, but every time Tommy Robinson comes up, it looks like it's a conversation none of them want to have. Rupert Lowe might be an exception, but they don't want to talk about it because their opinion on him probably is, my God, why are you bringing it up again? He's not useful. He's just a criminal. I don't want to talk about him. I don't see him as relevant. And unfortunately, there is a cohort of people in the UK that really do like him, and Reform are aware that they are the party that, to some extent, is going to have to represent them. The problem is that there's an awful lot more people who absolutely hate Tommy Robinson, and that includes people on the right. And I would argue for fair reasons, but we're not going to get into that this video. And so it keeps putting them in this position where they can't say anything too negative that they probably frankly want to say about Tommy Robinson, because, again, it'll just be everywhere in the news. And yet at the same time, they can't fully defend him. One, because they don't believe he is fully defensible, and two, because it's then going to irritate the cohort of people that are massive Tommy Robinson fans, and Reform are going to be brought up again at the next protest as, oh, this party, you know, they hate you, they look down on you because you're working class, which doesn't make any sense because they have Lee Anderson in there, who's done an interview about his working class roots with The Express, and it was very, very interesting. It's just nonsense that they have this working class bigotry. It doesn't exist. And talks on the alternative media of them having this, I think are just a smear, and I think absolutely need to stop. But as I said, even in this clip of Farage talking about something he doesn't want to talk about again, he still seems settled and relaxed, even though it's clearly something he doesn't want to talk about and is uncomfortable with. I have absolutely no idea what you mean by they look very guarded, Carl.
As if it were? As if reform is at this point inevitable, and there's almost nothing that can be done to prevent your rise and inevitable victory. And honestly, I think that barring any kind of huge miscarriage by yourself, there's probably not.
So when it came to the advice on build a team for when you get victory, that stuff makes sense in this video. Why then are you advising them on campaigning if they're inevitable? I'm so confused by this. What was the point in this video, Carl, if it wasn't to improve their polls, which are already through the roof? I do not understand. What's the message here? What's the point? Because frankly, these pieces of advice are attaining to rather different things, but an awful lot of them seem to be on electoral campaigning, which, as you say, they're inevitably going to win anyway. What they're doing is very good stuff. And to be honest, the advice that's been good is stuff they're already doing. The advice that's been bad is stuff that they're not doing, and there's probably reason for that. So as I say, what was the point in this video? There's something wrong with the alternative right-wing media, especially those that, let's say, are further to the right than the ones that join in with mainstream media sometimes, let's say The Spectator and things like that, where it's pretty amazing how much they actually miss about what Reform is doing. And this doesn't reflect particularly well on you if this is supposed to be your job. Again, I'm not trying to sound harsh or, you know, this isn't coming from a place of disdain or anything like that. It's coming from a place of, I know you can do better than this, so I don't understand why you are not. Again, it has to be asked, what was the point of this video? If the good advice they're doing anyway, and the bad advice is bad advice for everyone, and not even reflective on what Trump's doing, because I know comparisons with Trump are made all the time.
So I think if you were to appear more like you are inevitably going to win, then the opponents of yours, any of the opposition, will seem insignificant, childish, and yesterday's men.
Yeah, well, they already seem that way to the largest cohort of voters, according to polls. Literally, all that's going on at the moment is we're just waiting. Like, we're letting time do its thing. This stuff doesn't happen overnight, and I don't understand why you think it would.
As I said at the beginning, I'm offering up this advice for free.
Yeah, I don't really get why you're repeating this. Everyone offers advice for free. Apart from, you know, maybe a few people who have good stature as, say, consultants.
I just think that these are open flanks that the Reform Party needs to guard a little more closely, because in them may lie the seeds of defeat, and if there's one thing I want, it's to see you win.
Right, well, as I said throughout this video, the good advice they're already doing, the bad advice they're not doing, there's probably a reason for that. Again, it kind of just has to be pointed out. They're top of the polls. They're only going up in the polls. Where do you think your advice is going to go with this? Like, there's more of a chance it's going to actually make them go down in the polls, I'm afraid to say. Again, not to sound too overly harsh, but Carl is very good at a lot of things. One thing he's not very good at is real politics. He's not good at electoral politics. His advice over the years has been questionable. His campaign as a UKIP MEP, very questionable. And frankly, if he were to do it again, I don't think he'd do half of what he did. He'd probably go around doing the let's talk to members of the public thing. That was absolutely incredibly good. The stuff he did with the media, though, largely it didn't quite work out, and I think he'd have completely different tactics this time round, or at least you hope he would. Well, actually, no, that's questionable, would he? Because a lot of his advice to reform here is largely what he would do. Some of it was good, don't get me wrong, but some of it was bad as well. And my main advice to Carl here would be, can you actually please pay attention to what Reform are doing? I know that I am a Reform activist and my channel is very much focused on what Reform do, but again, I do this for free in my spare time. You know, you gotta be better.
It would be a very satisfying end to the story of Nigel Farage, just like Trump's victory was a very satisfying end to the story of Trump.
Well, Trump's story hasn't ended yet, has it? And he's got 4 years where he can easily screw it up. It's a bit early to say that. It's a satisfying chapter. I wouldn't say ending. And, well, this is the thing with Farage. He is being very careful with what he says. He is only really going down routes he knows will guarantee will up him in the polls. And I don't see what's wrong with him doing that. In fact, that was partly one of your piece of advice. It was your best one, I'd say. It's just, as I say, I don't understand how you're missing all this, and with that as well, what was the point in this video then if the good advice is being followed anyway, and the bad advice is just bad? I would reflect on things I've said here. You know, I give this advice out for free, and what you do with it is up to you. Anyway, I think with that is everything I had for today. Honestly, I went through that video, and quite quickly I thought, I feel like I need to talk about this, and I'm glad I did. Anyway, I think it's shill time, so no more streams this week, videos out as and when I can make them. When it comes to next week, we will have the Antiquity stream on Monday, where we'll be going through the end of the post-Peloponnesian War era, where, well, Sparta gets absolutely ruined by Macedonia. Tuesday it's Tosh News, so we'll be going through stories of the past 2 weeks, and then next Saturday we'll be laughing at the Guardian with some Warman. If you enjoy what I've done and said here, do subscribe and give a like. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. If you agree, let me know in the comments. It's all good for the algorithm. I don't really mind, and I do interact with the comments, so that's also a good reason to tell me what you think. If you think I deserve a little more, you can always send a super thanks in the comments of this video. That is a very direct way to help, and I do very much appreciate it. However, if you want a few more bonuses, you can always become a member from £2 a month, and that gives you access to all my previous Laughing at the Guardians, and, well, even Carl Benjamin was on one of them, God, 3-4 years ago now? I can't remember, it was a while ago. So that's the bonuses there. But anyway, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.